This is Lakshmi. Lakshmi's story transformed India. When she was 15, she was a pretty average kid. She went to school, had friends, went out on the weekends, went to the market. She wanted to be a TV presenter when she grew up. And like many girls in India, she sometimes faced unwanted attention from men. An older brother of a sister's friend started texting her, said, let's meet up, I love you, will you marry me? Like she'd done hundreds of times before, Lakshmi ignored it. When she was 16, she was at the market waiting for a bus, and this 32-year-old man who'd been texting her drove up with two friends, threw acid all over her face, all over her body, all over her arms. Lakshmi describes the most indescribable pain, something she'd never even imagined was possible, as her skin literally melted. This isn't an unusual situation in India. 2 or 3 times a week, women face this type of attack as men they've spurned or said no to, say, go out and buy acid and look to permanently disfigure them as a result of just not wanting their attention. And what typically happens in these situations is that survivors, they withdraw from society. They drop out of work, they drop out of school, they hide behind a veil and shut themselves out from the world. Suicide is not uncommon. But something was different in this particular situation. After 8 years, Lakshmi decided to take off her veil. She told her story on a petition on change.org, on a video on YouTube. She told her story, what she had been through, and what she wanted. And what happened next broke all of the rules. The reaction was electric. Tens of thousands of people shared her story, rallied to her cause. The media couldn't get enough of what she was standing for, and she shook a political and judicial elite that for decades had systematically ignored this violence against women. She shook them to the core, such that within weeks of her sharing her story, the sale of acid over the counter was totally regulated for the first time ever. And punishment for men who traditionally had perpetrated this and who'd gotten away with it was dramatically accelerated. This was due to Lakshmi's story. And consider for a second, this is one of the most marginalized and disempowered people in the world, a survivor of a horrific attack, traditionally shunned by society. And through her story, she totally changed the game. She was able to mobilize people, cut through a message, and change national policy in a way that had never been done before. And this was due to the power of her story. Now, over the next few minutes, what I want to share are what some of the principles are of great storytelling like Lakshmi's, which mobilizes people to act. I see stories like Lakshmi's every day. I work with an organization called change.org. Change.org is a web platform that allows anyone, anywhere, to start a campaign, fundraising or advocacy campaign around an issue that they care about. And there is an extraordinary number of people who've done so. More than 1.5 million campaigns have been started on the site. And there are more than 130 million people who are using change.org to advance the issues they care about. Of those 1.5 million campaigns, there are some that succeed and some that don't. And every single one of them is an attempt to mobilize, an attempt to communicate, an attempt to persuade. And so I've dug through all of this data, looked at what campaigns, what messages, what stories cut through in a way that persuades people to act. There have been almost 1 billion actions taken on campaigns on change.org. And the campaigns that inspire those actions typically have 3 things in common. So there are 3 things that I'm going to discuss today that form the core of the great stories that we see on change.org that mobilize people to take action and that persuade them to be involved in different issues and causes. The first is finding an emotional hook. The second, framing the crisis-opportunity. Third is generating agency. So the first that I'm going to discuss is an emotional hook. How do you capture someone's attention and their focus in a way that draws them into a story and inspires them and drives them to act? The reality is, in the digital communications environment that exists in the world today, you have a fraction of a second to capture someone's attention. To capture someone's attention and then engage them in a way which is going to persuade them to take action, be it engaging with your startup, buying a product, or taking action on a campaign. And the way to do this is emotion. Emotions are what motivates action, whether it's hope, whether it's fear, whether it's urgency. There are some emotions that are better for mobilizing action, and there are some which actually inhibit mobilizing action. And so as you're telling a story, the best stories will be the ones that engage with emotions that motivate rather than drive inertia. So the emotions that are more likely to motivate are things like urgency, hope, the idea that you can make a difference, anger, solidarity. These are the emotions that you need to be driving for in the stories that you're telling. You need to avoid the emotions that prevent people from acting. Inertia, fear, self-doubt, isolation, or even apathy. These are all things to be wary of. How to tap into these emotions? Stories are a lens that people use to view the world. It helps us make sense of all of this data, all of these inputs that we're getting on a daily basis. And in any story, there is a very common narrative arc that you can understand to drive emotion in the stories that you're telling. In most stories, there's a hero, there's a victim, and there's a villain. And understanding the characters that are in your story and the emotions that each of those characters inspire is the best way for you to connect with and inspire or mobilize an audience. So typically, a villain is someone who's going to mobilize people through anger. These are the people that frustrate us, that enrage us, that when we look at what's wrong with the world, the perpetrators, the villains, what they're doing, it inspires anger. And this can be an extremely powerful motivator. And so when you're thinking about how to tell a story, is there a villain that you can tell a story about that is going to inspire the types of anger, the types of frustration, which actually catalyze someone to do something good? But if it's not a villain, maybe it's a hero. Maybe it's a hero like Lakshmi, someone who actually started out being perceived as a victim, someone who we empathize with because of the shared experiences or our ability to imagine ourselves in her scenario, but someone who was able to achieve something incredible and inspire us as a result. Your role as a storyteller is to identify who are the characters in your story that you can draw on and that you can place into a narrative so that you can inspire the types of emotions which hook people into the story and then drive them to take action. The second thread that great stories that mobilize people to action have in common is that they tell a story of a crisis-opportunity. Now, a crisis-opportunity is a moment in time where a critical and urgent challenge is faced, combined with a unique opportunity to solve that challenge. It combines two very powerful motivators. On the one hand, something terrible is about to happen. There's a reason that there's a saying, bad news sells newspapers. Pew Research did a study over 25 years and consistently found that stories about war, disaster, violence were the things that people paid the most attention to. And this is a natural human instinct to identify danger, things that could affect us in a dramatic way. And so we can't ignore the fact that crises, danger, are incredible motivators that capture people's attention. But we have to remember, we're here to mobilize people to take action. We don't want to depress them. We don't want to make them feel like there's nothing they can do. And so it's incredibly important that alongside the crisis, we match the opportunity. The opportunity that says we're on the brink of something great. Yes, we face this incredible crisis that should bring all of our attention to focus on it, but there is this once-off opportunity for us to change everything and find a solution. And when you know that this is a technique that can be used to mobilize people and to engage them, whether it's in a product or a campaign, you'll start seeing it over and over again. This juxtaposition of crisis and opportunity. There's two examples that I wanted to share. The first is Elon Musk. He recently launched the Tesla Powerwall. This is the battery which he thinks is going to transform the way that solar energy is stored, captured, and used in household homes. And he recently gave a product launch that many have said is one of the best product launches in the last few decades, beating Steve Jobs' announcement of the iPhone. And if you look at this presentation, and I recommend that you go out and watch it, if you look at it, you'll see that Elon Musk uses this crisis-opportunity technique over and over and over again. Crisis. We are running the most dangerous experiment in history right now, which is to see how much CO2 the atmosphere can handle before there is an environmental catastrophe. That gets your attention. It focuses us. But he doesn't leave it hanging there. Opportunity. We have this handy fusion reactor in the sky. It's called the sun. You don't have to do anything, it just works. It shows up every day and produces ridiculous amounts of power. Solar panels and these batteries, it's the only path that I know that we can use to do this, to solve this problem. And I think it's something that we must do, and that we can do, and that we will do. Crisis, opportunity. Throughout that entire presentation that he gives, he uses that technique over and over again. In this way that Lakshmi told her story, she juxtaposed crisis and opportunity. She says, 2 men threw acid on me when I was 15. In the last 3 months, more than 60 of these cases have been reported across India. This is a crisis right now. But there is an opportunity. We can build enormous pressure on the minister, let him know the whole country is watching, and we have less than a week to do this. It's this juxtaposition of crisis and opportunity, incredibly powerful motivator. And crisis opportunities, identifying the crisis opportunities that apply to your organization, your business, your campaign, the crisis that you're seeking to address and the opportunity that exists to solve it, and putting those two side by side is one of the most powerful storytelling techniques that you can use to mobilize people to act. The third feature of great stories that mobilize is agency. They generate agency in the audience. And the reason why this is important, and this is one of the things that has changed the most in the last decade, it's not enough for good storytelling to just connect or inspire. It's not enough to engage people deeply, but leave them as passive consumers. The opportunities provided by the digital age, by the ability to connect online, is to actually involve people in every element of the story. And the best stories do this. They weave it deeply into the core of how they're telling their story, of the messages that they're sending, that you as the audience have a role to play in completing this story. There are two ways that good stories build this into the core of their narrative. The first is what's called the theory of change. An audience-focused theory of change is a cause and effect sequence that begins with an action the audience can take and ends with a resolution to the crisis that you were talking about earlier. It has audience participation, involvement, engagement, and action built into the core of the story. That's the theory of change. Another way that it can be done is through a story of us. A story of us is fundamentally about telling a story of a collective community, telling a story of the values and experiences and what we have in common. And this can be done by understanding the audience really well and talking about the things that you have in common with that audience and saying, here are the things that we value together, here are the things that we'll focus on as a result. There are two examples that I actually wanted to share about this. The first is Coney 2012. You may remember this, a few years ago, the most viral video of all time. Whatever you think about the effectiveness of that campaign, this is undoubtedly one of the single best pieces of storytelling that social good causes has seen ever. And when you look at the narrative structure of the Coney 2012 video, you'll see that audience participation is built into and assumed throughout the entire way the story is told. The Coney 2012 opens with a few minutes of them talking about how we're in a new digital age, how we're connecting with friends online, how we're sharing content, and how this opens up the possibility of power and of impact in a way that has never previously existed. And then as the story continues and as they draw towards the conclusion of the story, they talk about directly, they lay out a theory of change about how the action of the audience, in this case, sharing the content, the thing that they've been telling a story about the whole way through, how that can directly lead to the outcome that they have been pointing everyone towards throughout that story. You can see how they break down step by step. In order for Coney to be arrested, the Ugandan military has to find him. In order to find him, they need technology and training, and on and on and on it goes down as they break down step by step and they connect it all back to you, the audience, and then say, we need you to take action, this action that we've been building you up to this entire story. The second example that does this really well is Bernie Sanders. Now, this is the US presidential candidate who's running for Democratic nomination and who's mobilized unprecedented amounts of money. He's raised more than $100 million and from more than 4 million individual donors. He's blown out of the water the amount of money that Barack Obama was able to raise at the same time of the race in 2008. This is extraordinary. And when you look at his core messages, and again, I would encourage you to do so, you'll see that throughout all of the stories that he's telling, he's talking about this story of us. He says about how we are going to do something different. How we're going to prove that we're a democracy that's not owned by billionaires, but by individuals. He's talking about how this isn't about him, it's about a political revolution that hundreds of thousands and millions of people each own a part of when they contribute to his campaign. And so throughout every single thing that he says, this concept of us together, the we, is core to what he is communicating. And it's that story of us that is mobilizing people in untold numbers to contribute to his campaign. And so when you step back and you think about what's the story that you want to be telling, you should be thinking about how do you make sure you don't just ask for money or ask for people to buy your product or ask people to take action on your campaign or initiative right at the end. It should not be an add-on. It should not be something that comes as an afterthought. It's something that you need to build into every aspect of the story that you tell so that you're priming people, inviting them to be part of what you're creating together. And that's what the best stories are doing these days, and that's what we're seeing work on the millions of campaigns that are on change.org. These are the three lessons for what I see work most frequently when it comes to mobilizing people to act through stories. And the reality is that we live in a pretty unprecedented time. At no other point in human history has one person been able to share a story, for that story to travel around the world, unmediated by any one individual or organization, and inspire people to act in a way which transforms nations, continents, or the world. Lakshmi, who I was telling you about earlier, and whose early dream before she was attacked was to grow up and to be a TV presenter. A few years ago, she was awarded the International Women of Courage Award. Michelle Obama handed the award to her personally. She's since gone back to India and now runs and helps run an organization called Stop Acid Attacks. And she's recently asked to become a TV presenter. She's the face of this issue, but is also the face of a generation of people who are, through their story, inspiring other people to act. And if there's one final thought that I'd leave you with, while those three stories, those three themes that I mentioned remain true, the one thing I would say to keep in mind is authenticity. Because the thing that we see work over and over again is when it's authentic stories, which are told by real individuals. You can get the best copywriters in the world in a room and wordsmith every single word of how to tell a perfect story. And then you can put that side by side with someone who, in a moment of anger or of inspiration or of hurt, writes down or records their story. And if you compare those side by side, 7 times out of 10, the authentic personal version will win. I know that because we've tried it. At change.org, we literally have tested those things side by side, and 7 times out of 10, the authentic, personal, real, raw content is what actually connects most with people. And so when you're looking to tell your stories about your products or about your campaigns or about your organizations, go out there and find the people who are affected by what you do and who are in support of what you do. Get them to tell your story in their own words. Identify the language they use, the way they talk about it. And then lift up that content, lift up those stories, because that's what's actually going to connect most.